Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Truth Be Told Minuteman Report from somewhere in North America, an undisclosed location. I am your Minuteman, Robert Hensley, and again, welcome. So I'm going to drop a heavy word to start today's episode, and that word is genocide. And I know that we like to think of genocide, we think of a lot of other countries. We don't necessarily think of the United States government, but whether we'd like to admit it or not, the United States has blood on its hands, right? We look down our noses at other countries which have actively engaged in genocide, but our own government has engaged in the same acts against the indigenous peoples of North America, and whether we like to admit it or not, we've kind of glossed over it in the history books and like to pretend that we haven't done it. However, that's not the truth. So in the 19th and the 20th centuries, the governments of the United States, along with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Russia, China, and across Africa, planned for the cultural rather than the physical extermination of indigenous peoples. The extermination of these peoples was found that it would be too expensive, right? It was more economical to destroy their culture than to actually kill off an entire tribe. In the United States, it was concluded that it would cost $1 million to kill a native in warfare, but would only cost $1,200 to school a child for 8 years, right? And when I talk about schools, we're talking about the Indian boarding schools, right? It was a program of assimilation, if you will. So in the United States, it would have cost a total of $22 million to wage war against Native Americans over a 10-year period, but it would cost less than a quarter of that to re-educate 30,000 children for a year. So backing up here a little bit, so culture, right? Culture is defined as the characteristics, the combined knowledge of a particular group. It encompasses language, religion, cuisine, social habits, music, and arts. According to the Center for Advanced Research on Language Acquisition, culture is further defined as, and I quote, shared patterns of behaviors and interactions, cognitive constructs and understanding that are learned by socialization, and an identity fostered by social patterns unique to a group, right? And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about cultural genocide, right? It was too expensive to just kill the people. So what they did was they took their children away from them and then taught their children not to be Native American. Christina de Rossi, who is an anthropologist at Barnet and Southgate College in London, has said, and again, this is a quote, Culture encompasses religion, food, what they wear, how they wear it, the language, marriage, music, what they believe is right and wrong, how they sit at the table, how they greet visitors, how they behave with loved ones, and a million other things, right? So we're literally talking about what identifies a group of people as people, right? It's their identity. That's what we were trying to squash. So now there was a study done by the United Nations, and what they found was that in the United States and Canada, Native children en masse were forcibly removed from their homes as a way to address the quote-unquote Indian problem. The policy was save the man, kill the Indian. In other words, for Native peoples to become fully human, which just kind of kills me, they would have to lose their native cultures, okay? So the rationale being that boarding schools would provide a means for indigenous peoples to achieve status in the dominant society. The focus on industrial boarding schools in many areas signified that indigenous children were not given the education that they needed to assimilate to higher echelons of this larger society, but instead they were trained to do basically slave labor, domestic work, manual labor, and they were never paid for that. Again, this, the more you learn, right? Because this took me down a rabbit hole, stuff that I wish I had learned in American history, but I didn't. So in an act that once again defied the separation of church and state, Indigenous children were abducted, right? We're going to call it what it is, abducted from their homes to attend Christian and government-run boarding schools as state policy. This was formalized under Grant's peace policy of 1869 and 1870, which turned over the administration of the Indian boarding schools to not just the boarding schools, but the entire Indian reservations, to Christian denominations, right, to missionaries. So Congress actually set aside funds to erect schools, these day schools, boarding schools on Indian reservations to be administered by churches and missionary groups. So that's number one. That kind of sucks. And then in 1879, the first off-reservation boarding school was constructed in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It was founded by this guy, Richard Pratt, who argued that as long as boarding schools were primarily situated on reservations, it was too easy for children to run away from the school to go home. And that the efforts to assimilate the native children into boarding schools would be reversed when the children went back to their families. He proposed a system where children would be taken away from their families at an early age and then not returned to their homes until they were young adults, right? So get them young, beat the native out of them, and then return them when they no longer remembered how to be a Native American. By 1909, there were 25 off-reservation boarding schools, 157 on-reservation boarding schools, and 307 day schools in operation. Thousands of Native children were forced into attending these schools. Okay, these schools were run as cheaply as possible. There was inadequate food, medical care. The situation was overcrowded, right? According to the Boarding School Healing Project, Native children in South Dakota schools were often fed only one sandwich a day, right? That's it. One sandwich for an entire day. So children were dying of starvation and disease. And these are common medical ailments that they were dying of just because of simple neglect. Children were forced to do grueling work so that they could raise money for the schools and for the salaries of the teachers and administrators. Some survivors of the boarding schools reported that children were killed while operating dangerous machinery. And again, the children were never compensated for their work. The families were never compensated for the loss of life. So these children who were forcibly taken from their homes for the majority of the year, this attendance in these schools, it wasn't something that families could opt into or out of. It was mandatory. They were forced to cut their hair, worship as Christians, only speak English, right? Their native traditions and languages were prohibited, right? So there are stories of children having their, fingers broken and jaws broken for being caught speaking a native tongue. Some native survivors reported that after their stay in the boarding schools, they never spoke their native tongue again, right? And that's part of what they were going for, right? So if these natives could no longer have their own language and they lost their identity, then they were more easily controlled. Sexual, physical, and emotional abuses were rampant, right? Regular occurrences. Children were forced to beat other children. There are stories of children being sent through a whipping line, right? So kind of like Solid Gold, dancers, only instead of dancing their way down through their friends, they went down a line so that they could be beaten by the older children. Survivors reported sexual abuse by multiple perpetrators, and boarding school officials refused to investigate, right? Even when teachers were publicly accused by children and their families. They just didn't care. So as recently as 1987, the FBI found that, and these are some stories that are really, really frustrating. I mean, they piss you off is what they do. So 1987, the FBI found that there was a teacher at the Bureau of Indian Affairs who administered a Hopi day school in Arizona. He had sexually abused over 142 boys. But the school's principal never investigated any allegation of abuse, right? There were another 12 children who came forward with allegations of molestation against an instructor at a Navajo reservation. In North Carolina, a school instructor was employed between the years of 1971 and 1985, before he was arrested of assaulting boys. And in all of these cases, supervisors just, ignored what was going on because these children were less than human, right? Because they weren't white, right? And then this one is the one that really, the cherry on the cake. A boarding school teacher admitted on his job application, right, before he was ever hired, admitted that he had been arrested for child sexual abuse, and he was hired anyway, and was later convicted of sexual abuse against the students, right? And these reports are not just against male instructors; these are male and female personnel, right, who routinely abused these children, and in a lot of cases, this led to student suicide, right? This is shit you think is just in the movies, right? It's just in a novel, but this happened. This happened to thousands of Native American students, all because the United States felt that we needed to be able to control them and take their land. And the number of children who died, right? Abused is one thing, but we're talking about children who died. Thousands of children. They were beaten to death, medical neglect, malnutrition. If you look at schools like the Haskell Indian School alone has 102 student graves and 500 students, right? 500 other students died and were buried elsewhere, right? That's over 600 students. And 500 of them are buried somewhere that no one knows, right? The practice of the schools when children died at the school was that their dead bodies were simply dumped at the doors of their families' homes. In one boarding school, they even found skeletal remains of babies in the walls of the school after it was torn down. Where did those babies come from, you ask? Well, I'm sure that the girls who were sexually abused in that school could tell you. Now, in the summer of 2021, both Canada and Australia began paying reparations to boarding and residential school survivors, right? Christian organizations which had run the schools have started to apologize for their complacency and their role in the abuse and death that happened in those schools. A lot of schools are pushing for the Pope to publicly apologize for the role of the Roman Catholic Church in these schools. But of course, the U.S. government, we have yet to apologize nor offer any form of victim support or any kind of reparation policy for effectively wiping out numerous native languages and cultures across North America. And I just keep thinking that if these were white kids, right, no one would ever let this happen. And then it kills me too that we pretend that, we're so good and we're so wholesome and we've never done anything bad and we have nothing to apologize, and that our history is spotless, but it's not. And again, I couldn't let Native American Heritage Month pass without acknowledging that that as a country, we've done some shitty things to the people who were here before us. I just think that we all need to be aware, right? Because knowledge is power, and knowing that about something that happened means that we can't let that repeat, right? We can't let that happen again. So anyway, thank you so much for joining me today for another live episode of the Minuteman Report. If you like this content, please be sure to like it on YouTube, comment, share it, subscribe so you know when there's new content coming. And there's always new content 3 times a week. Me on Mondays at 3 p.m. Pacific. Then we've got Bonnie Burkert on Wednesdays with Truth Be Told Transformation at 3 p.m. Pacific, and Tony Sweet with the original Truth Be Told on Friday afternoons at 3 p.m. Pacific as well. And if you want to know more about Truth Be Told, please feel free to visit us online at www.truthbetoldworldwide.com, where you can also click on the shop button and find some out of this world merchandise. All right, everybody, thanks so much, and we will see you next week.